Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. A real pleasure to welcome to the program Lainey Newman, research assistant at Harvard Law School, author of Rust Belt Union Blues, Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party, written with Theda Skocpol, who I believe we've had on at least once or twice in the past. Lainey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Let's start with this is basically like a combination of an ethnography and sort of social research. Just give us a sense, just so we have before we get into the content, like what was involved in your research here?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. It is sort of the combination of an ethnographic study and sort of more of a social science academic project. And what most of the research involved was interview data and archival data that we sort of compiled and looked at trends to sort of get a sense of, what was changing over time. I interviewed a lot of retired union members and current union members in the Western Pennsylvania region. And then I also visited several archives as well as local unions and looked at records and documents, including newsletters over time, to sort of get a sense of how people were, how the unions were sort of portraying issues and what they were talking about and communicating with their members. And then finally, we did do, ethnographic research, which part of which was the whole bumper sticker analysis and looking at, union members, bumper stickers and employee parking lots at the steel mills. And then also just sort of going around and taking pictures of some of these old steel towns in Western Pennsylvania.
And we should say this is, more or less your hometown area, or at least adjacent to. And some of the people you started off interviewing were family members, and then you expanded as you needed to get, sort of, I guess, less self-selected groups of people in some way. But for folks who don't know, what is the Rust Belt?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the Rust Belt, I think it's kind of an amorphous term, but I think it generally refers to the industrial Midwest, this sort of aggregate of, heavy industry or ex-industry areas in sort of the upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, parts of New York, Buffalo, Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan, and areas that I think generally have seen a decline in economic activity in manufacturing as heavy industry has sort of left the U.S. And been consolidated. But yeah, I think it stretches. It's it's a little bit hard to define geographically, but it's generally within that region.
And also, just so that we have both parts, I guess, of the title defined. When we're talking about union, you're looking at specific types of unions here. Tell us what those unions are.
Yeah, we looked at mostly unions that have historically been manufacturing or industrial unions. And then we also looked at some of the trade unions being historically the craft unions. So International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers or bricklayers, insulators, sort of those were historically the AFL. And then the industry or the manufacturing unions, the auto workers, the steel workers, the miners, these large CIO unions that now have really expanded beyond those initial original industries. So, steel workers no longer only represent people in steel mills, but also, nurses and librarians and others. But historically, those unions that were focused on and representing manufacturing workers and industry workers.
And why that cohort?
I think that back to what you initially said, I'm from Pittsburgh, and those were the unions sort of in this area, really active in this area. And I think we wanted to look at the changing political outlooks of people who historically were members of unions and had that as a driving force in their political ideology. And so, there's been a lot of work done on sort of quote unquote the white working class. We wanted to look at a subset of what a lot of people have historically considered to be part of the working class, which is blue collar union members. And within that, most of the quintessential or sort of archetypal union man was this industry or manufacturing worker in these industrial regions, and sort of looking at the political evolution of that particular population was really interesting to us.
What I found really interesting too was this, and I guess it was maybe around, I want to say the 90s or the early 2000s maybe. There was a lot of talk about the loss of a third place. And the third place being, we had work, we have home, and then there's a sort of like a place where people would socialize. And talk about the role that unions played in these workers' lives, because in some level it was like a rolling third place, or specifically like an actual third place, being these union halls, and then also sort of the ethnic sort of like group halls.
Right.
Explain that for us.
Yeah, definitely. And so this part of the research really built off of Professor Skocpol and Robert Putnam and previous sociologists that have documented the decline of civic associations in the U.S. But I think with unions particularly, unions had this sort of really interesting place in community life. They were institutions that brought people together, that brought workers together in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace. And that's something that I think that the scholarship has underemphasized up until this point. And the role that they played outside of the workplace was really broad, actually. So they not only were involved, in sort of collective bargaining or, political activity in getting their members to vote for, whatever candidate, but also in organizing community events, in working with other local organizations, and in being involved in religious affairs in communities. They also, were I guess had a really big role to play in providing information and news to members. So they, local unions sent newsletters to members. International unions sent magazines to members, and then in many places there were even labor newspapers that were funded by some of the unions together. And so I think that unions now have been sort of cabined into this sort of economic sphere, but historically speaking, in the mid 20th century, being a union man or a union family was not limited to the workplace. It really did span across all different parts of people's lives, and that's something that we tried to highlight in the book.
It's like basically constituted the social life in many respects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about the numbers. I mean, and is there any way to like sort of identify like how people have identified themselves? Like, would people? It seems to me, just anecdotally, that in 1950 or 60 maybe, you could find one of these guys, more often than not guys, in the context of these unions in particular. Who would say, like, if you asked them, like, within a very quick amount of time in a conversation, would identify themselves as a union guy, as opposed to a union guy today, where that may not come up
right
until deep into a conversation. Is there any data in terms of the way that like people, identified themselves, and how much of that became, that we perceive of like identity politics? Like that was just that was a shifting identity, I guess.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I wish that there was a data set that sort of looked at that. I think, what we tried to do is look at how people, we actually looked in the records of, for the term union man, in newsletters and in convention reports and whatnot, conference reports, and looked at how the union man was being talked about, in what capacity, what that really meant to people. And I think that what you're getting at is exactly right, that it was much more salient to workers in the mid 20th century, their membership to the union, than to many workers today, when being a member of a union isn't necessarily something that is a defining, characteristic for them in their social or political or even their self identity. And so I think that has to do with the extent to which unions in the past sort of really integrated themselves into workers and families and communities' lives. And we're not only sort of circumscribed to being a collective bargaining unit, but we're really part of how people identified themselves. And we talk about, there's some really great examples in the records of, older members saying, my most prized possession is my union card, and this union is just essentially things that make clear how important it was to people that they were union members. And I think that salience of being a union man, being a union woman, being a union family is something that's gone down over time.
The ability for the union to have this kind of social, be a part of the social fabric, right? I mean, that has to do, I would imagine, with the resources that they had at the time, in part due to the fact that they probably had such high numbers, right? I mean, it's a chicken or the egg situation, but if you could talk about that dynamic historically.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think that the decline in resources and in membership density really was a huge blow to the ability of unions to maintain this sort of deep level of community engagement. There were also changing legal rules and sort of a lot of efforts from various conservative entities to sort of circumscribe unions into this particular sphere. And so declining dues, declining membership, these really significant blows to industry and manufacturing in the in the 70s and 80s, and the collapse of the steel industry, in particular, I think took a lot of, at first it resulted in everyone coming together and being, sort of trying to save industry and support one another. And then eventually, because of, loss after loss, eventually led to people disintegrating. And the sort of remnants of in the Rust Belt of those the industrial unions, because of the numbers, lower numbers of people, because of the lower numbers of dues money and these other issues, it's much more difficult, I think, now to fully integrate into the social and community lives.
You can't support like a nice union hall with with a kegerator if you don't have enough members, essentially, who are going to be there. All right. Before we get to like the relationship with the Democratic Party and how that sort of like it mixes. Well, let's just also talk about what happens when that third place, either as an actual place or as speaking as like a psychographic, entity, which one identifies with and where one goes to sort of get, support and community and whatnot. What happens when that goes away? I mean, because there was a quote in your book, something to the effect of like, about a guy who had been like, if it wasn't for the union, the guy would have probably been in the KKK. Talk about that dynamic, because that void gets filled in some way, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think it's, it's human nature to seek community, to seek a sense of belonging, and that sort of need doesn't go away when unions do. And so, when unions are no longer there, I think in a lot of respects, unions were providing a counterweight to a lot of the more conservative, socially conservative, politically conservative narratives that have always been out there, right? But like what you were just saying, the quote that you just mentioned, the member that said that if it weren't for being a member of the United Mine Workers, that he would have been in the KKK. Obviously, problematic in many regards, but that the union was providing this sort of sense of community and sense of belonging for that person. And and a counterweight, a counterweight to more conservative and socially conservative and clearly, really prejudiced influences. And so I think that what you have when that goes away is just the filling of that void with more of that, of those voices and of those groups. And we talk a little bit in the book about the social role of gun clubs now in a lot of these industrial or ex-industrial regions, and that the presence and influences in these regions is almost entirely and exclusively conservative in nature in terms of what those community organizations are sort of promoting. And so there's no counterweight anymore, which I think is part of the problem.
Can you also talk about, like, you bring up in the book, and I guess this is also sort of like generational, right? Like how far away you get from your parents being first generation immigrants, but the existence and I'm in this area in particular, I think like Polish social clubs, Lithuanian social clubs, these type of organizations, and how sort of like the union affiliation and socialization that happens around that, those conversations also sort of like happen in these sort of adjacent spaces. And it just becomes like a way of, it becomes like, this is the way that like culture and ideas spread. Will you talk about that relationship?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. I think that, all of these institutions and sort of the networks that people had, we find, really impacted one another. And so conversations and sort of identity being built and undergirded by union membership wasn't limited to, only happening at the union hall, but people were also interacting with their coworkers or, their union peers at other institutions in the community, like the ethnic clubs, like smaller religious organizations, and even gun clubs and rifle clubs that have always existed in most of these areas. So some of my retirees told me, they would go up to the shooting range, with friends, and that was, what they did on the weekends or what have you. But the difference, I think, is that, when the union has a role to play in the community as a key institution, and is hosting, for example, coin trading events, which is, I'm just thinking of some of the newsletters we went through, or sponsoring a derby, soapbox derby or whatever. Exactly, like culture is sort of built on, and those. Even though it's not expressly stated that the union is, promoting certain political ideals, it's sort of it goes throughout the forum or the exchange of social conversation, and it's a very different picture when the backdrop is an NRA affiliated gun club that doesn't, and there's no sort of presence or counterweight that expresses a more progressive stance on issues and expresses, values of working class coalition building. So I do think that the fact that local unions were very integrated with all of these institutions meant that not only was the union influence limited to the actual union hall or workplace, but it, in these other places where members were socializing with other members, those peer-to-peer relationships strengthened, and that actually helped, preserve the influence of the union.
How much of the nature of unions too trains either sort of consciously or sort of unconsciously its members to expand I don't want to say proselytizing, but like if you're in an organization that is fundamentally democratic and that is involved in sort of like, group power and empowering each other and built to support, and you're providing, like, I pay dues so that, if we go out on strike, you're also being able to support your mom who's sick or that type of thing. Like, how much of the nature of a union, as opposed to, let's say, I'm a, I don't know, a member of like a Lego club or what, I don't know what would supply. How much of that actually sort of implicates their ability to influence the community outside of the parameters of the union?
Yeah. So I think what you're getting at is sort of the difference between the union being, having an underlying political message and sort of underlying political sort of outlook, as opposed to being a completely neutral, organization or civic organization. Like, is that what you're sort of saying?
Yeah, I mean, not just like politics in terms of ideology, but almost in practice. Like the relationship between, union members, even on its surface, can look maybe like I belong to, I don't know, the Rotary Club. But in the way that they interact, it creates a different way of interacting with other people. Does that make sense? So like the structure of the union in and of itself is, I guess it's praxis on some level.
Yeah. I think that's something that I think the peer-to-peer and like member-to-member connections were really what drove the sort of identity behind being like a democratic, a political member of the union, whatever that meant. And something that I think this is that, the peer connections, at least in our perspective, were much more important historically than, these top-down political messages. And so in sort of in the sense of, that these relationships are praxis, I guess what I think of is, they reinforce themselves, if that makes sense. So like the political messaging came from within. It was really sort of a grassroots identity, as opposed to being, I guess the top union officials saying vote for this guy, which historically, I mean, we now know based on polling data that union members and don't really like when the president tells them who to vote for. But that's always been the case. We found research or data from the mid 50s saying we don't really want the top union guys to be of the international union to tell us how to vote, and yet every sort of the basis of people's political sort of outlooks were sort of reinforced by their peers and by the community that they were part of, as opposed to sort of the top down at that time.
Let's talk about the relationship with the Democratic Party. So this, what happens first? Like there is, there's this notion that the sort of the Democratic Party abandoned working class people or union people, and certainly in the wake of like the way that primaries were restructured under the McGovern Commission, this prior to him running for office, they basically said, we're not going to allow the unions to sort of sit in a back room, and we're going to actually have primaries, which are going to allow people to vote. That obviously undercut, and there was and Jimmy Carter was, I think more hostile to unions than he gets credit for at this point. But what was the beginning of the end here, particularly in this? Obviously, we're talking about these unions.
Yeah, it's a good question. Sort of going back to the chicken or the egg problem, but I do think that the beginning of the end was, I think, some conscious decisions on the part of policymakers, including Democrats, to sort of to not invest or prioritize other issues, other groups potentially, in this, I would say around the late 60s and 70s, particularly the 70s. And I do agree that I think, Carter and the Carter administration, I think, was a sort of a key turning point for this population of union members, particularly. And I think that, in the 70s and 80s, when steel was really struggling, there were many calls for the steel industry to be bailed out or to be, sort of supported by the government. And those
in the way that the Obama administration did with the car companies, essentially, in the wake of the financial crisis.
Exactly. And so, and Carter rejected those calls. And I think that, the different, like, it's hard to imagine the counterfactual, of course, but it's, I think that things would be different if that decision had been the reverse. And there was this sense of that this was inevitable, that, we were moving towards a sort of service-based economy and knowledge-based economy, that manufacturing was inevitably going to leave the U.S. But those decisions and inaction by policymakers was really, really important, I think, in this whole story and this trajectory. And so that's what I would sort of pinpoint for the beginning of the end.
It's the Atari Democrats. I can't remember. She wrote that book, but we could see that in Massachusetts in the context of the 128 or 495, I guess, Beltway of growth of knowledge professionals, as it were. What's it? Lily Geismer. Yes, exactly. And so what? And then once that starts there, like what? It just becomes a sort of, I guess, a feedback loop. The idea becomes that unions are becoming less relevant to Democrats, so Democrats become less relevant to unions, and all of this sort of the union density diminishes like tremendously over the course of 50 years, and there's nothing to replace it except for, I guess, Fox TV and gun clubs and whatnot. That seems to be the sort of like overarching story.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I think that throughout the 80s, even some of my interviewees assumed that Reagan had won the Western Pennsylvania region in the 80s, which isn't true. I mean, I think that, union power held on for a while, but and in part, sort of galvanized by this idea of, saving itself. And unfortunately, over time, that really sort of died off because, there was so much loss. And as union density has decreased, as dues has, have decreased. And importantly, as sort of these big industrial unions that used to represent a certain, identity of people in heavy industry or manufacturing have diversified, people's sort of relationship to the union in these original industries has sort of just lost salience. And you're right that there's not much to replace it with in terms of a progressive counterweight to, all of these conservative messages that people hear from Fox News, from the NRA, and that type of thing.
Where's race in all of this? Like the one of the stories that I feel like I've heard for a while is that the loss of union support was a function of the Democratic Party in the mid to late 60s becoming more focused on emancipatory movements of Black people, of women, of minorities, or I guess marginalized people in general. Where does that story fit into the work you've done here? Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I think that that claim. So I think we kind of disagree with the claim that it had to be an either or type thing. So I think that there was a huge sort of transition in the 60s. I don't think anyone would disagree with that on the priorities of the Democratic Party. But I think that, the power of unions in terms of equalizing, racial pay gaps, decreasing racial resentment between Americans, has been, is very clear. And there were, there's in people of color and workers of color were being hugely benefited by unions. I mean, we talk a little bit in the book about how the Black middle class was grown and built on via unions in some parts of the Rust Belt. And so I think that sort of separating these two concepts of either, we can sort of advance these equality notions or, support labor, is kind of a narrative that we've chosen to buy into, as opposed to something that was necessary at the time, or that, maybe was, even true at the time of a lot of policymakers that were trying to do both. But in the end, it does seem that, the sort of the choice, that policies that sort of promoted equality were given priority, and that's, that makes sense in a lot of ways. But I do think that they can both coexist at the same time, and that one doesn't have to mean the loss of the other.
Do you have a sense of if the diminishment of unions and union density had an inverse relationship to sort of racial attitudes? I mean, because we're dealing with obviously post Civil Rights Act, and LBJ, famously said, "I'm going to lose the South for generations." And Western Pennsylvania is not necessarily the South, although I've heard people describe, Pennsylvania as like, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and then Alabama in the middle type of thing. And like, how much was unionizing sort of a mitigating factor in the in racist tendencies or racism?
I think hugely. I mean, hugely. We talked to actually a lot of interviewees about this, both white and Black interviewees, and current and former members. The research shows, there's been some research done on this, that statistically speaking, it's clear that racial resentment does go down when given unions presence. But I also think that, just in terms of exposure to people who aren't like oneself, and working with people of different races, being on the same team, quote unquote, as people of other races, and this sort of extends as well to gender at a certain point. The beginning of these integration movements were hugely difficult for the people who were in these spaces, but I do think that there was a massive amount of progress made in unions. I mean, unions came out very much in support of the civil rights movement, even if the local level unions weren't as supportive. The overall stance of the union, I think, really did make a difference, and did sort of, in the end, win the day. And I think people I talked to, both current and former members, just have talked very frankly about the role that unions have played in understanding one another, and in feeling like they're on the same side of things, and that the person down the line from them is it doesn't matter who they are, it doesn't matter what they look like, but they're one person said, like, when your life is in the hands of the guy down the line, that person's a brother to you no matter what. And so, like, I think that's the general idea, that people, it's a exposure and being on the same side as others is one of the things that unions did to reduce racial antagonism.
This may be a little bit out of the scope, it's certainly outside the scope of this particular research, but are there areas or other unions where this dynamic of union identity, union life, like becoming becoming a new third place, at least if not literally place, but sort of psychically or psychologically, I guess. I mean, is there, do you see that happening in other areas today? Other unions, other sort of like union sectors?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing that we talk a bit about in the book is the sort of the craft unions that have done a slightly, maybe better job of maintaining a sense of union identity than some
this
of
is comparing the steel workers to the electric
to
workers.
the electrical workers, to the IBEW. And so, I mean, I think that that's based on our finding that, the craft unions have largely kept to their original industry, and the industrial unions have largely diversified beyond their original industry. And I think that the craft unions also had they're sort of are often the hiring halls for members, and members are on projects, at least in the case of the IBEW, that then end, and then sort of, so the union itself is the sort of de facto employer, the consistent employer, and then they go out on projects. And because of that dynamic, it's less place-based and less sort of like the union had to find other ways to sort of reach out to members, to coalesce members, to create a community. And so sort of innovative communication techniques emerged, and getting together, and keeping in touch with members in different places, and organizing events in different places. And so I think that model has potentially survived in a slightly more effective way. But I also think that a lot of the service unions have been doing, are on the forefront and have been doing a lot of interesting work. And it's not to say that the industrial unions haven't as well. I mean, I think that there's a lot going on in labor right now that's very exciting. But I would say that sort of maintaining that historical model of being able to communicate and maintain relations despite being, separated geographically, I think has sort of has been effective over time.
Are you seeing any of that? I mean, we have like a sort of a revived UAW, it feels like, at least, one that's getting a lot more aggressive and trying to unionize other places, and sort of amongst teachers as well, it feels like, over the past decade. These aren't necessarily, I mean, maybe the UAW is a little closer to the steelworkers than the teachers, but are you seeing sort of those techniques applied there? Or again, this might be outside of your...
I mean, I think the UAW is a really interesting example going on, really fascinating right now. And I do think that they've used some of these techniques to maintain communication and relations between people. I also think that, I mean, President Shawn Fain of the UAW has done a really good job of, I think, reconnecting the union to various identity strands in people, and sort of grabbing onto the sense of us versus them that I think a lot of unions used to really take advantage of. And so, I mean, I do think that the UAW and maybe the teachers, I'm not as familiar with the teachers, but have been taking these techniques and sort of propelling them into the future.
Lastly, I think if I remember correctly, and if I'm not remembering correctly, forgive me, but I think you did some work around, like, I think it was in the wake of the 2020 election or the 22 election, about what was happening with Pennsylvania suburban women in some of that reach. I'm just curious, as you look into this coming election, what do you think is going to be the story, one way or another, in terms of like specific cohorts and turnout and who's energized in a way that, like, maybe it was 2018. I mean, there was a lot of like groups of voters who were, maybe they would vote, but they weren't quite as engaged as they were in the wake of like the Trump presidency, and certainly I would imagine now there's a whole nother, sort of like quality to this because of the repeal of Roe v. Wade. But do you have a sense of what might be that story this cycle?
In Pennsylvania specifically, I mean, I think it's hard to say. I mean, I worry a lot about young voters right now. I think that's something that is on everyone's minds, potentially. But in Pennsylvania, I mean, I think that the work that the Biden administration has done on labor-related issues, on infrastructure, I'm hoping that will be, enough to get some of the swing voters or women, middle of the road voters, even moderate Republicans potentially, to come out and vote. I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot in our book is that it's not as easy as, coming around just during an election cycle and trying to ask for people's votes. It takes a lot more long-term work and long-term, movement building and community outreach than that. And so, I think that the Democrats have a long way to go in rebuilding in a lot of these areas, and it will take a significant investment. But I am hopeful that some of these, some of the policies that the Biden administration has worked on, which I do think has been, they've done a lot, and I think they don't get enough credit for a lot of the policy I think that they've worked on. So hopefully that will sort of swing enough people in Pennsylvania.